I'm Tony Sutton. I'm an assistant professor of Native American Studies and Food Systems at the University of Maine, and I was the supporting author to the Sea Run Fisheries Report.
I'm Judd Esty-Kendall. I'm a retired attorney. I was a legal services attorney for many years, and I did some of the initial research. Tony and I both did the initial research, and then sort of the initial drafting, so we'd have a product that people could then react to and try to hone into a better finished product.
What surprised you most as you researched this report, and what were the biggest takeaways for you?
I'm not sure about surprise, but learned the most about was, well, three things. One, the conscious effort starting in colonial times and continuing to separate Wabanaki people from the places that they depended upon for their livelihood. This was conscious policy right from the beginning. Even though you can always look at the Wabanaki position in any of the treaties that were signed back in those days or negotiated, and it always had to do with having access to those places that were traditional places for gathering food, for travel, etc. So that's one of the things. The second was the degree to which the sea run fish in particular were destroyed, how they went from almost unimaginably vast floods of fish to this tiny trickle of fish that didn't get very far up the streams or didn't get very far at all. And the third was, I think for me, a much better understanding of the different ways that Wabanaki people through culture and language would view the concepts that were being negotiated as opposed to the state. And of course I was obviously aware of the level of power that the state has had to enforce their vision, but how deeply different those visions are, where sustenance to the state is a matter of catching some food. The Wabanaki people, it's a matter of essentially keeping the whole culture afloat, the whole community afloat. Anyway, those are the things that really surprised me, or that I learned.
Yeah, and I think, like, related to what Judd was saying, I had a tribal elder said to me one time when he learned the things that I was interested in, he said, nobody knows the story of what happened to our food. And the report really provides, like Judd was saying, it provides insight into that story and what has happened to it over time. And I think the thing that stood out to me the most is, since I'm a little bit more familiar with that story, is just all the policy that was created with a lack of Indigenous participation, starting with things like water policy and how deeply embedded industry users were within developing that. So it always maintained, their lifeways, but that was always at a contradiction to Indigenous lifeways. And you can see that pattern through time. And then that a lot of the fisheries management policies were developed with a lack of that, again, Indigenous presence in there. And then those policies have very strict enforcement upon Indigenous people. But when you look at something like the requirement of fish passage, it's been a very lax kind of requirement put on users of the river. So there's some, power dynamics that are going on with those policies and how they're implemented as well. So that'd be kind of things that stood out to me.
An interesting part of this is that it wasn't just settler people versus Wabanaki people in terms of the resources. There was a real split within the settler community as well. Poorer people, working people, depended on fish to eat certainly in the colonial days and at times of economic downturn. And they opposed and sent petitions, opposed the industrialization and the damming of the rivers. And the one historical fact that really impressed me in doing the report, in the late 1860s, it was shortly after the Civil War, Maine created their Commission of Fisheries, commissioners of fisheries, and they stated as state policy that they wanted to restore the fish, which already had pretty drastically reduced, not as much as happened later. And at the same time, the governor, which was Joshua Chamberlain at the time, who's Maine's iconic, heroic, wise Moses figure almost, if you will, had a survey done of all the points where hydropower could be created in the Maine rivers, and waxed poetic about doing so and how this was Maine's future. And so there's two policies articulated by the state that are at total odds, and the commissioners of fisheries in their reports are almost brutal in their protests against what was happening. But that policy did not win out. The industrialization policy did, and you can attribute that to money, to jobs, to people's mindsets, all kinds of things. But it wasn't just, that one dynamic. There were divisions all over the place in terms of what to do. The Commissioner of Fisheries talked about how the state had destroyed a resource, the value of which outweighed all the lumber that had ever been taken or would be taken in Maine.